Chapter 3 of Book 1 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Weaver. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel, Florence HAPGOOD. Book 1. A few pages of history. Chapter 3. Louis Philippe. Revolutions have a terrible arm and a happy hand. They strike firmly and choose well. Even incomplete, even debased and abused, and reduced to their state of a junior revolution, like the Revolution of 1830, they nearly always retain sufficient providential lucidity to prevent them from falling amiss. Their eclipse is never an abdication. Nevertheless, let us not boast too loudly. Revolutions also may be deceived, and grave errors have been seen. Let us return to 1830. 1830, in its deviation, had good luck. In the establishment which entitled itself order after the Revolution had been cut short, the king amounted to more than royalty. Louis Philippe was a rare man. The son of a father to whom history will accord certain attenuating circumstances, but also as worthy of esteem as that father had been of blame. Possessing all private virtues and many public virtues, careful of his health, of his fortune, of his person, of his affairs, knowing the value of a minute and not always the value of a year, sober, serene, peaceable, patient, a good man and a good prince, sleeping with his wife, and having in his palace lackeys charged with the duty of showing the conjugal bed to the bourgeois, an ostentation of the regular sleeping apartment which had become useful after the former illegitimate displays of the elder branch, knowing all the languages of Europe, and, what is more rare, all the languages of all interests, and speaking them, an admirable representative of the middle class, but outstripping it, and in every way greater than it, possessing excellent sense, while appreciating the blood from which he had sprung, counting most of all on his intrinsic worth, and on the question of his race very particular, declaring himself Orleans and not Bourbon. Thoroughly the first prince of the blood royal, while he was still only a serene highness, but a frank bourgeois from the day he became king. Diffuse in public, concise in private, reputed but not proved to be a miser. At bottom, one of those economists who are readily prodigal at their own fancy or duty. Lettered, but not very sensitive to letters. A gentleman, but not a chevalier. Simple, calm, and strong, adored by his family and his household. A fascinating talker, an undeceived statesman, inwardly cold, dominated by immediate interest, always governing at the shortest range, incapable of rancor and gratitude, making use without mercy of superiority on mediocrity, clever in getting parliamentary majorities to put in the wrong those mysterious unanimities which mattered duly under thrones, unreserved, sometimes imprudent in his lack of reserve, but with marvelous address in that imprudence, fertile in expedients, in countenances, in masks, making France fear Europe, and Europe France, incontestably fond of his country, but preferring his family, assuming more domination than authority, and more authority than dignity, a disposition which has this unfortunate property, that as it turns everything into success, it admits of ruse and does not absolutely repudiate baseness, but which has this valuable side, that it preserves politics from violent shocks, the state from fractures, and society from catastrophes. Minute, correct, vigilant, attentive, sagacious, indefatigable, contradicting himself at times and giving himself the lie, bold against Austria and Ancona, obstinate against England in Spain, bombarding Antwerp and paying off Pritchard, signing the Marseillais with conviction, inaccessible to despondency, to lassitude, to the taste for the beautiful and the ideal, to daring generosity, to utopia, to chimeras, to wrath, to vanity, to fear, possessing all the forms of personal intrepidity, a general at Valmy, a soldier at Jemappes, attacked 8 times by regicide, and always smiling, brave as a grenadier, courageous as a thinker, uneasy only in the face of the chances of a European shaking up, and unfitted for great political adventures, always ready to risk his life, never his work, distinguishing his will and influence in order that he might be obeyed as an intelligence rather than as a king, endowed with observation and not with divination, not very attentive to minds, but knowing men, that is to say, requiring to see in order to judge, prompt and penetrating good sense, practical wisdom, easy speech, prodigious memory, drawing incessantly on this memory, his only point of resemblance with Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon. Knowing deeds, facts, details, dates, proper names, ignorant of tendencies, passions, the diverse geniuses of the crowd, the interior aspirations, the hidden and obscure uprisings of souls, in a word, all that can be designated as the invisible currents of consciences, accepted by the surface, but little in accord with France lower down, extricating himself by dint of tact, governing too much and not enough, his own first minister, excellent at creating out of the pettiness of realities an obstacle to the immensity of ideas, mingling a genuine creative faculty of civilization, of order and organization, an indescribable spirit of proceedings and chicanery, the founder and lawyer of a dynasty, having something of Charlemagne and something of an attorney, in short, a lofty and original figure, a prince who understood how to create authority in spite of the uneasiness of France, and power in spite of the jealousy of Europe. Louis Philippe will be classed among the eminent men of his century, and would be ranked among the most illustrious governors of history, had he loved glory but a little, and if he had had the sentiment of what is great to the same degree as the feeling for what is useful. Louis Philippe had been handsome, and in his old age he remained graceful. Not always approved by the nation, he always was so by the masses. He pleased. He had that gift of charming. He lacked majesty. He wore no crown, although a king, and no white hair, although an old man. His manners belonged to the old regime, and his habits to the new, a mixture of the noble and the bourgeois which suited 1830. Louis Philippe was transition reigning. He had preserved the ancient pronunciation and the ancient orthography which he placed at the service of opinions modern. He loved Poland and Hungary, but he wrote les Polonais, and he pronounced les Hongrais. He wore the uniform of the National Guard, like Charles X, and the ribbon of the Legion of Honor, like Napoleon. He went a little to chapel, not at all to the chase, never to the opera, incorruptible by sacristans, by worshippers in, by ballet dancers. This made a part of his bourgeois popularity. He had no heart. He went out with his umbrella under his arm, and this umbrella long formed a part of his aureole. He was a bit of a mason, a bit of a gardener, something of a doctor. He bled a postilion who had tumbled from his horse. Louis Philippe no more went about without his lancet than did Henry IV without his poniard. The royalists jeered at this ridiculous king, the first who had ever shed blood without the object of healing. For the grievances against Louis Philippe, there is one deduction to be made. There is that which accuses the royalty, that which accuses the reign, that which accuses the king. 3 columns which all give different totals. Democratic right confiscated, progress becomes a matter of secondary interest. The protests of the street violently repressed. Military execution of insurrections. The rising passed over by arms. The Rue Transnonain, the councils of war, the absorption of the real country by the legal country on half shares with 300,000 privileged persons. These are the deeds of royalty. Belgium refused. Algeria too harshly conquered, and, as in the case of India, by the English, with more barbarism than civilization. The breach of faith to Abd el-Kader, Blayais, Deutsch bought, Pritchard paid. These are the doings of the reign. The policy which was more domestic than national was the doing of the king. As will be seen, the proper deduction having been made, the king's charge is decreased. This is his great fault. He was modest in the name of France. Whence arises this fault? We will state it. Louis Philippe was rather too much of a paternal king. That incubation of a family with the objection of founding a dynasty is afraid of everything and does not like to be disturbed. Hence excessive timidity, which is displeasing to the people, who have the 14th of July in their civil and Austerlitz in their military traditions. Moreover, if we deduct the public duties which require to be fulfilled first of all, that deep tenderness of Louis Philippe towards his family was deserved by the family. That domestic group was worthy of admiration. Virtues there dwelt side by side with talents. One of Louis Philippe's daughters, Marie de Orleans, placed the name of her race among artists, as Charles de Orleans had placed it among poets. She made of her soul a marble which she named Jeanne d'Arc. Two of Louis Philippe's daughters elicited from Metternich this eulogium. They are young people such as are rarely seen, and princes such as are never seen. This without any dissimulation, and also without any exaggeration, is the truth about Louis Philippe. To be prince equality, to bear in his own person the contradiction of the Restoration and the Revolution, to have that disquieting side of the revolutionary which becomes reassuring in governing power, therein lay the fortune of Louis Philippe in 1830. Never was there a more complete adaptation of a man to an event. The one entered into the other, and the incarnation took place. Louis Philippe is 1830 made man. Moreover, he had in his favor that great recommendation to the throne, exile. He had been proscribed, a wanderer, poor. He had lived by his own labor. In Switzerland, this heir to the richest princely domains in France had sold an old horse in order to obtain bread. At Reichenau, he gave lessons in mathematics, while his sister Adelaide did wool work and sewed. These souvenirs connected with a king rendered the bourgeoisie enthusiastic. He had with his own hands demolished the iron cage of Mont Saint-Maquille, built by Louis XI and used by Louis XV. He was the companion of Dumouriez. He was the friend of Lafayette. He had belonged to the Jacobins' club. Marabout had slapped him on the shoulder. Danton had said to him, "Young man." At the age of 24, in '93, being then Monsieur de Chartres, he had witnessed from the depth of a box the trial of Louis XVI, so well named, that poor tyrant. The blind clairvoyance of the Revolution, breaking royalty in the king and the king with royalty, did so almost without noticing the man in the fierce crushing of the idea, the vast storm of the Assembly tribunal, the public wrath interrogating Carpe, not knowing what to reply, the alarming stupefied vacillation by the royal head beneath that sombre breath, the relative innocence of all in that catastrophe of those who condemned as well as of the man condemned. He had looked on those things. He had contemplated that giddiness. He had seen the centuries appear before the bar of the Assembly Convention. He had beheld behind Louis XVI that unfortunate passer-by who was made responsible, the terrible culprit, the monarchy, rise through the shadows, and there had lingered in his soul the respectful fear of these immense justices of the populace, which are almost as impersonal as the justice of God. The trace left in him by the Revolution was prodigious. Its memory was like a living imprint of those great years, minute by minute. One day, in the presence of a witness whom we are not permitted to doubt, he rectified from memory the whole of the letter A in the alphabetical list of the Constituent Assembly. Louis Philippe was a king of the broad daylight. While he reigned, the press was free, the tribune was free, conscience and speech were free. The laws of September are open to sight. Although fully aware of the gnawing power of light on privileges, he left his throne exposed to the light. History will do justice to him for this loyalty. Louis Philippe, like all historical men who have passed from the scene, is today put on trial by the human conscience. His case is as yet only in the lower court. The hour when history speaks with its free and venerable accent has not yet sounded for him. The moment has not come to pronounce a definite judgment on this king. The austere and illustrious historian, Louis Blanc, has himself recently softened his first verdict. Louis Philippe was elected by those two almosts which are called the 221 and 1830, that is to say, by a half parliament and a half revolution. And in any case, from the superior point of view where philosophy must place itself, we cannot judge him here, as the reader has seen above, except with certain reservations in the name of the absolute democratic principle. In the eyes of the absolute, outside these two rights, the right of man in the first place, and the right of the people in the second, all is usurpation. But what we can say, even at the present day, that after making these reserves, is, that to sum up the whole, and in whatever manner he is considered, Louis Philippe, taken in himself, and from the point of view of human goodness, will remain, to use the antique language of ancient history, one of the best princes who ever sat on a throne. What is there against him? That throne. Take away Louis Philippe the king, there remains the man, and the man is good. He is good at times, even to the point of being admirable. Often, in the midst of his greatest souvenirs, after a day of conflict with the whole diplomacy of the continent, he returned at night to his apartments, and there, exhausted with fatigue, overwhelmed with sleep, what did he do? He took a death sentence and passed the night in revising a criminal suit, considering it something to hold his own against Europe, but that it was a still greater matter to rescue a man from the executioner. He obstinately maintained his opinion against his keeper of the seals. He disputed the ground with the guillotine foot by foot against the crown attorneys, those chatterers of the law, as he called them. Sometimes the pile of sentences covered his table. He examined them all. It was anguish to him to abandon these miserable, condemned heads. One day he said to the same witness to whom we have recently referred, "I won 7 last night." During the early years of his reign, the death penalty was as good as abolished, and the erection of a scaffold was a violence committed against the king. The Greve having disappeared with the elder branch, a bourgeois place of execution was instituted under the name of the Barrière Saint-Jacques. Practical men felt the necessity of a quasi-legitimate guillotine, and this was one of the victories of Casimir Perier, who represented the narrow sides of the bourgeoisie, over Louis Philippe, who represented its liberal sides. Louis Philippe annotated Beccaria with his own hand. After the Fieschi machine, he exclaimed, "What a pity that I was not wounded! Then I might have pardoned." On another occasion, alluding to the resistance offered by his ministry, he wrote in connection with a political criminal, who is one of the most generous figures of our day, "His pardon is granted. It only remains for me to obtain it." Louis Philippe was as gentle as Louis IX, and as kindly as Henry IV. Now, to our mind in history, where kindness is the rarest of pearls, the man who is kindly almost takes precedence of the man who is great. Louis Philippe, having been severely judged by some, harshly perhaps by others, it is quite natural that a man, himself a phantom at the present day, who knew that king, should come and testify in his favor before history. This deposition, whatever else it may be, is evidently, and above all things, entirely disinterested. An epitaph penned by a dead man is sincere. One shade may console another shade. The sharing of the same shadows confers the right to praise it. It is not greatly to be feared that it will ever be said of two tombs in exile, "This one flattered the other." End of Book 1, Chapter 3. Recording by Rachel Weaver, Boston, Massachusetts.